Welcome to the latest episode of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. My guest today is John Alverdy, who is an endowed professor of surgery and the executive vice chair of the Department of Surgery in the University of Chicago, where he has spent essentially most of his professional career. He certainly did not arrive at his current exalted position through a standard route. He went to medical school in Guadalajara in Mexico, and then returned to Chicago, his hometown, before undertaking surgical residency training at the Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, a research fellowship in San Francisco, and then returning to Chicago for faculty. He's been NIH funded since 1999 and recently stepped down from active clinical practice, but continues to run his lab 3 days a week. He's perhaps best known internationally for his work on the relationship between the microbiome and anastomotic leaks, but in fairness, his real interest in life is the interaction between human beings and the surroundings. He's an avid musician and is as interested in working out the genius behind John Coltrane as he is the complexities of anastomotic leaks. Don't forget, please, to like and subscribe to the channel and send whatever comments you may have. Without further ado, let's go across and join the conversation with John Alverdy. I'm John Monson, and this is Surgeons' Lives. So, John, thank you so much for joining this afternoon to this little episode of Surgeons' Lives. I really appreciate you taking time out of your life on an afternoon when I'm sure you have better things to be doing. If you've had the opportunity to see any of these in the past, and indeed, this will be the third from the University of Chicago.
Wow.
I'm sure that's statistically significant. In fact, the very first was His Excellency Dr. Matthews. So I normally ask people just to start with a few words, a little background life by starting with the words I was born in. So fire away.
Well, thank you, John, for the invitation. And I'm glad you're doing this. I think it's important to the field for people to see the human being behind the so-called, I guess you would call it, academic profile of a person. And I was born and raised in Chicago. Um, my parents were, my father was born in Chicago. My mother was born in Connecticut, and they met at a wedding. And my father was the son of an immigrant who came from who was thrown out of Iran because of there was a persecution of Armenians and Assyrians at the time because they were Catholics in a Muslim country. And so they emigrated to the United States, and my grandfather was a bricklayer, and my father went to Northwestern and became a dentist, and had that sort of immigrant mentality as doctor, engineer, lawyer, or you're going to starve to death, which, had no interest in becoming a surgeon, let alone a surgeon scientist. But I sort of fell into it, and I went to medical school in Mexico for 3 years because I had a cousin down there who was trying to get into medical school in the United States, and I only applied to one medical school, that medical school. That was it. And then I came back to the United States and went to Loyola for a year. And
And
then,
literally, that was because of your cousin. That was the reason.
yeah, I mean, I applied to no other medical school in the entire world, and none into the United States, none there. I remember going to my pre-med advisor and saying, My dad really wants me to be a doctor, and I took all these scientific classes, and I really didn't like it very much. And he said, well, you could apply to medical schools and you could increase your GPA and you could go to graduate school and get a master's degree in biology. I go, I hate biology. And here I am,
Yeah.
having a lab and all this other stuff. And it was just kind of funny. And so
So
I
did
didn't do that. I
that
just I just went and visited my cousin because my major was in Spanish and I could go down there and speak Spanish. And it was kind of fun. And I applied to that medical school, got in, and never left. 3 years later, I
yeah,
came to the United States.
I've already encountered now multiple what the word is ethnicity, origin mixtures, born and bred Chicago, Armenian, Mexico, etc., etc. Uh, I mean, did you ever? I mean, it was kind of rash in retrospect applying for medical school in Guadalajara, etc. And it goes without saying that it ultimately did not hold you back. But uh, I think it could have. Just the way the system works, it could easily have. I mean, it's not something you would likely recommend to a mentee today.
No, no, in fact, so many of the students down there had been applying for years. They were smart, you know, kids who went to American colleges
Yeah,
and
yeah.
had applied to medical schools through several cycles, didn't get in. And I'm like, you know, it was hard for me to relate to them because I'm just like down there having a good time studying medicine, speaking a language I had an interest in, and then, I marched through and you'd say, well, did you always want to be a surgeon? No. Did you always want to be a doctor? No. Did you always want to be a scientist with a NIH funded laboratory? I'm like, no. Well, how did you do that? I'm like, I don't know. I
Well, just as
came into
importantly,
medicine.
what did you want to do at that point?
I wanted to be a diplomat. Funny
Okay.
that you started this out in with some political observations. I thought I spoke, I grew up speaking another language. I learned to speak Spanish pretty well, was a Spanish major. And I said, I'm going to apply. There were two schools of foreign affairs at the time, Georgetown and Harvard. I had looked into both. I was going to apply to schools there and go there. And, um, and that's what I wanted to do. I thought of myself as somebody with speaking multiple languages and somehow being involved in government. That
And
that's what I that's what I felt was inside of me. And it turns out and you saw my PowerPoint on music that, I played piano and had interest in music. And it I think being a surgeon and being a scientist spoke to my need to have some sort of creative outlet. It spoke to me in the sense that, you know, um, this is the way you could create new knowledge in the field, like I guess creating a new song, which I can't do, you know, and and even Juilliard graduates or Berklee School of
yeah,
Music graduates, it doesn't guarantee you that you're going to be a creative artist. So that is kind of where I got that whole notion of um, there's a difference between being music is one of the only mediums in which you can have no formal training and yet have celebrity and,
yes,
make a
yeah.
lot of money. In medicine, engineering, or law, I guess, if you will, you have to go to school, you have to pass tests, you have to achieve things. And so I'm starting to see the difference between what it means to be an academic surgeon and what it means to be a surgeon scientist, and they're not the same. and they shouldn't be the same. And, people worry about this diminishing, the death, the extinction of the surgeon scientist. I'm like, it's kind of natural. You go through 10 years of training now, you become, I don't know, a pediatric cardiac surgeon, you're 40 some years old, and your choices are, hey, let's, you know, take a post where I have to write grants, write papers, get rejections, get criticized, rewrite the grants, rewrite the papers,
Mm.
or operate, have an audience, um, maybe where you're originally from. They call it an operating theater. Here
Yep.
we call it an operating room,
Yep.
but it really is a theater
Yep.
because there's a lot of theater going on there. There's a lot of theatrics. There's an audience, and it's a kind of a seductress in a way. You
Well,
train a
and
long time to do
usually,
this. You get to do a skill.
yeah.
People pay you. Everybody's happy. Why would you want to torture yourself?
And they used to come and watch as well in the background. So there's a lot to unpack there now, and I'll try and unpack some of it. And I'll start by pointing out that the other profession where you need no training whatsoever to become famous and usually make some money is, of course, politics. Um,
You know?
um, but we will skip that for the moment.
Oh, no, no, you have to be a genius. Oh, yeah, a tortured
Or at least you
genius.
have to have somebody who tells you you are.
That's right. And
Yeah,
it's usually yourself.
exactly. So now, from uh, I'm intrigued by your interest in diplomacy. One of my oldest friends in surgery is, I think, a triple threat in that regard. He's Armenian, diplomatic, and a surgeon, who is Aradarzi, in London. And he's Armenian background, of course, and an outstandingly good surgeon, but probably, completely unexpectedly, I would imagine, and he's about to do one of these actually, um, became a diplomat. And, one of the questions I propose to ask him is, does he think he will have achieved more by being from the diplomacy rather than the surgery? As a surgeon, you fix 100 people or 1,000 people. As a diplomat, you can potentially fix 1 million people, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're down there in Guadalajara, living the dream, having fun, um, where did this, when you're coming up to your final year in Mexico, what was the plan then? Was it diplomacy or was it surgery?
No, it was you know, getting re-enter the goal at that point. So I was in it all the way was passing, my board tests,
Right.
you had to
Okay.
pass,
Yeah.
you had to pass all these exams to get into the United States system and then to assimilate into the United States
Yeah.
system. I mean, I didn't know how to say PT, PTT, all these ABG, all this lexicon was new to me. So I came into the American system, learned it by spending 1 year at Loyola University's Medical Center, and um, and then um, and then entered into a residency at Michael Reese, which was the University of Chicago affiliate at the time, and my the program director there said to me, "You're really smart. You need to go into the laboratory." So I remember coming home to my wife and going, I'm not sure if I'm going into the lab because I'm a smart ass or I'm smart.
Right.
Because I don't know if you remember, John, you're still too young to remember this, but back in my day in 1982 at the time, if you were no good as a surgeon, technically, they threw you in the lab.
So you've
So
just
I ended up at UCSF with George Sheldon at San Francisco General
yeah.
Hospital. And that's where I was bit by the bug. I'm like, people pay you to kill mice and pipette and ask questions and think beyond sewing tissues together and use 8-0 versus 7-0 or 4-0 or this, that. I'm like, this is amazing. I think I like doing this. And I was good at that. And, you end up following your path, that things that you're good at and are rewarded for. And that seemed to be it for me. That's kind of all it took.
But the challenge, of course, was even then and is now that they may pay you to kill all those rats, but they don't pay you a lot compared to the dude who's operating. And indeed, and I think it was 1994, George Block wrote a paper that I remember reading in 1994 called The Sky is Falling. And it was yet again talking about the imminent demise of academic surgery. And in that paper, there's a comment that addresses the issue of who is more valuable, the person who operates on 5,000 patients a week, or the person who's in the lab. And they, of course, are treated very differently by organizations. And, just imagine in 1994 or 84, the way they were differentially treated compared to now. There's no question that the 5,000 operations a week guy is the winner today. And even then, there was a problem. And he points out in that paper that, trying to prove one is more valuable than the other is a fool's errand because they both have value. And, one makes the organization famous, the other is a clinical lead, et cetera, et cetera. You have lived through that transition.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I knew George Block when I first got to the University of Chicago. He was sort of at the end of his career, at the end of his life, unfortunately.
Mhm.
But he's right. There's value in both. But here's what's interesting. Adam Smith, the famous Adam Smith, said, virtue is seeking excellence. Virtue is not some moral or religious or ethical thing. Virtue is seeking excellence of yourself and all others around you. And I think the graduates of today's program, they want to be excellent
Hmm.
at the thing that they do. So if they do a general surgery residency, spend 2 years in the lab, and they do it at a really good place, and then they get a fellowship at a really good place, and they see mentors who are excellent and dedicated and compulsive, they want to be like that. And they look at um, what it takes to be a scientist, or what I like to think of as a original composition songwriter,
Okay.
or in your case, an ambitious politician, maybe. And they say, that's too hard, or that maybe takes a talent I don't have. So academic surgery, when you say I've seen the face of that, I've seen that transition. It is true that departments of surgery have to be triple threats with different people now.
Mm.
And the way I see it is being an academic surgeon is now separating from being a surgeon scientist. And I wrote this paper, and it's been rejected everywhere. And you can imagine why it is. This paper has been rejected everywhere. I still have it. And it's called Medical Doctors Are Not Scientists. And I think it rubs everybody the wrong way. What do you mean I'm not a scientist? I studied physics. I test hypotheses. I do clinical trials. I'm like, I know what a scientist does. You are not a scientist.
Yeah.
And
I
unless
think we
you're
can work out why
writing,
it is not
yeah,
accepted.
yeah. And it's very hard for a medical doctor who patients are hanging on all their words, and you've got to set their expectations, set your own expectations, know what you can do and what you should do. There's a lot of nuance that goes on between you and that patient, selecting a therapy for them in an individualized, personalized way. It's not rote science. It's not knocking a gene out in an animal and seeing what phenotype it expresses and recomplementing that gene. Well, that's not what a medical doctor does. A medical doctor has all that knowledge and he has to deal with a patient and a family and a disease.
So, with that in mind, and there's always, I think back in the day of physiology research, when the vagus nerve was everybody's daily discussion. It barely gets a mention these days, but
I cut plenty of them.
yeah, exactly. Well, people of our generation did, and then lo and behold, the disease disappeared. Never mind the operation, but it was possible to be a surgeon scientist at that time because the nature of the science was, shall we say, a little less demanding. When the world became DNA navigators or molecular constructors, it it became increasingly difficult, which is another way of saying nigh on impossible, to achieve that level of scientific excellence whilst pursuing science as a hobby, shall we say, when your main job, your day job is operating on people in one thing or another. So my question would be federal funding success rates, let's call it 10%, no more, possibly even less. How do we as surgical mentors and indeed sometimes leaders encourage people to go into a sphere of interest where they have a less than 10% chance of succeeding, and they're going to live with the fact that they failed because even if you even if you give them backup for, the first 5 years, etc., most of them end up having that conversation that says, "Now you've failed, you need to just go to that clinic now, please." And nice try, but it's tough, yeah.
I sympathize with you, and it's becoming tougher.
Hmm.
And we have to ask this question, which is much more complicated. If we took the body of research that surgeons did 30 years ago, what percent of it was actually good science,
Yeah.
and what percent of it was being done as a career move, as a move to advance through a system, versus, you know, what must be done now to meet the expectation of a high impact journal and meet the expectation of an NIH review
Yeah.
study section or a chair who says, I only have a limited amount of money. I know you have an MD, PhD from Harvard and you're smart as hell and this, that, but this is a different thing. You know, that's why I wrote that that's why I made that presentation saying, here's Taylor Swift. She was homeschooled and never went to college. And here's Isak Perlman and Yo-Yo Ma, and they can't improvise. So, what is it that makes a hit song? I
Yeah.
mean, if everyone who just went to music school could write a hit song or shoot a basketball or hit a home run, whatever you want to call talent versus education and training, which is different.
It's
You
the
know,
X
we
factor,
have to
isn't it?
separate those in our head now.
Yeah. It's what became known as the X factor, you know. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. Etc.
And here's what the leader has to do. Let's say you're the chairman of a department or the head of a section, and you're like saying, okay, I've got to pick my rainmaker, the person who, let's say, you know, went to a high-end college and a high-end medical school, has a great pedigree and trained at the best places. And you're like, all right, this person is going to attract a lot of patients and do a lot of surgery and make a lot of money. And this person spent 3 years getting a PhD and I can't pay him that much. I can't pay him like a colorectal surgeon, but I need them to study, I don't know, whatever you want them to study, wound healing or whatever it is. And you've got to create a section or a department that has a reputation, just like you mentioned previously when you were talking about George Block, that has a reputation that it's excellent at both.
Mm.
You're like, but what do I do with the guy who's billing $2 million a year and collecting $1 million? And the guy who's sitting in a laboratory phosphorylating all day?
Yep. Yeah.
And who's willing to do that? What's interesting is, sitting on the tenure committee at the University of Chicago, which is why I wrote that one slide saying it's, where fun comes to die. Listening to these people, you know, um, get knocked down by the committee on promotions with 2 3 hour ones, and they're like,
Yeah.
don't make tenure. You're like sitting there going, why would anyone in their right mind who could get into any law school, any medical school they applied to, put themselves in this position? Like, there are medieval historians that have studied medieval history their whole life, and they come to the University of Chicago and they've got to write books and papers or they're out.
Yeah, I think the one that I always say to people, and I'm sure I've got these statistics wrong, but the one job I would never take in the University of Chicago is in the Department of Economics, because I think they have three Nobel Prize winners there. I mean, if you really want to feel bad about yourself,
Right. So, you know, um, I said this to Jeff Matthews once. I said, we need to sort of understand people's ambition to talent ratio. And I've used this analogy. It may be right, it may not be right. I said, when you look in the cockpit of an airplane, like a commercial jet, you go, I could never fly this plane. Too many dials. You got to learn all this stuff and maps and forget it. 10,000 hours later, you go, I got this. I could do this in my
yeah,
sleep. And it takes maybe a surgeon to be my age to say, the last 10 years of my practice, what I was doing, and I did mostly minimally invasive foregut stuff, I could have done in my sleep. I was doing robotic surgery lab. I'm like, why does anyone think this is hard? Because it takes a long time to train to do it, and you need that expertise. And you need to be smart enough, but you don't need to be the smartest guy in
sure. Yeah.
physics at Princeton to be able to be a doctor. But you do need to have some smarts and you need to be diligent and disciplined and all that other stuff. That's all good. And,
I mean,
and
it's
that's what I'm starting to
commonly,
separate out talent from
yeah,
training. Training means you're trainable, you're smart enough to be trained. Talent, I mean, can you make if somebody golfs a lot, can you become Tiger Woods? Not really.
yeah. I mean, it's commonly stated about lots of professions or whatever it might be that the best are often not the most talented. They need enough talent. Um, but the what marks them out from going from number five to number one is, the 6 inches between the ears and, some other form. And, in surgery, task performance, stitching the stitches, cutting the cuts and all of that sort of stuff is very different to the craft of surgery, which involves, I spent an hour or so yesterday talking to somebody about the second and the third victim of surgery. That's, the dismay when you've knocked over the cell culture is different to, and lost a week's work, is a little different to when you're in the ICU with the patient having a major complication that is your fault, etc. That's a different skill again, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a different skill, and I think that, I'm sure you've seen this over your career too. There are those medical students that are risk aversive. They get into the operating room and they're like, "This is awesome, but I couldn't deal with all this stuff if something goes wrong." And so they're out. Others get there and they're like, "I cannot practice medicine and not do this." And there are those of us that are in the operating room, they're like, "I'll do this if I can train properly to do this, but take off somebody's skull, clip an aneurysm, and remove, I don't know, eighth grade through the end of college because I messed up and deal with them all stroked out in the ICU. I can't do that. That's too much."
Yeah,
Or stop their heart or whatever it is.
yeah.
So we all have our limit on just how much risk. It's like when you go to your financial advisor, he goes, "How much risk can you stomach?"
Exactly. And how you deal with the consequences, because people deal with that stress differently.
I
That,
know, I know. I've had, as you know, I've studied anastomotic leak and I've had my share of them, and no one's immune. And it devastates. The second victim is us.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You can talk to colleagues and present it at M&M, and people come up with their theories, and you leave there feeling like crap.
So you threw it out there like chum in the water, and I would be remiss, um, interviewing you for this if I didn't spend at least 5 or 6 minutes talking about, and I know this is not fair to say this, but what you are best known for, um, the microbiome and the anastomosis. I listened to a thing on the BBC a couple of days ago, talking about the rise in young cancers in young people, I should say. And amongst the theories, apart from the increase in artificial light, which I thought was an interesting one, is the unexpected side effect, potential unexpected side effect of the explosion of antibiotic usage beyond multi-drug resistance, but the alteration of the microbiome that may well be causing the development of cancer in young people. You've dedicated a decent chunk of your career to hovering around the microbiome. Can you can you tell us in relatively briefly
Sure,
um,
no, I
what's that
I've got the
story?
line. Yeah, the line goes like this. Every human, like every bacteria, is unique. No two species of humans are alike. No two species of bacteria are alike. We all have a life history baked into us. I do, you do. Every bacteria that's in our body has a life history. So it may started in soil. God knows how it got inside of our bodies, what house we lived in, how we were fed when we were young, what was in our mothers, on our mothers, or in our mothers' microbiome that colonized us. All of that is the life history of the host. It's very dependent on its exposures, antibiotics, vaccines, diet, and that microbiome programs your immune system and your outer surface cells, your skin, your lungs, your gut, to to regulate the genes that you inherited from your parents. So there's a strong, you know, life history, environmental exposures, gene transcript interaction that drives a phenotype. I developed cancer when I was 34, and one of my daughters, my youngest daughter, is a urology resident, and the girl that she brought on vacation with us, who's also a doctor, um, um, was a doctor, unfortunately, at age 34, developed abdominal distension, was found to have colon cancer that had metastasized, that was, metastasized widely to the lungs, brain, and liver and peritoneum. Underwent one of these high-tech,
Yeah.
um, procedures and ultimately died
Mm.
a year
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
A year later, she's dead. Chemotherapy, the whole thing,
Yeah.
all of it, peritectomy, uh, debulking, cytoreduction, call it whatever you like, and all the king's horses and all the king's men. And you're like, what was that? She was a young, otherwise thin, healthy appearing. It's one of these signet cell lesions of the colon, or
Yeah.
adenocarcinoma of the colon, right side. It was in her splenic flexure, actually.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
why didn't she get that when she was 70? And you've done
Yeah.
this, you've taken out these giant tumors and they're all contained right
Yeah.
there. Make
Mm.
them wrapped. You're like,
Mm.
it's nowhere else.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's had probably had been here 10 years. Why didn't it go anywhere?
Yeah. Mm. We have a lot to learn still. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do. So,
And I think I want to just say that the microbiome is no mystery. It's just another set of genes
yeah.
to account for. It's not, oh, it's the microbiome, the diet. It's like you can make it up any way you want. You've got to account for another gene pool. There are genes, they're metabolites, they make proteins, they interact. That's it.
So to put it in very crude terms, it took us, let's say, I don't know, I'm totally making this up, let's say 25 years to sort out the genome.
Mhm.
Do you think it'll take 25 to sort out the microbiome to the same level?
Well, the promissory note, I didn't have all of this in that one slide that I had in that presentation, but you know, what I wanted to say was, virulence, harmfulness, cancer, infection is neither a property of the microbiome nor a property of the host. It's a property of their interaction. So I've been like framing everything this way. A
Yes.
marriage gone south or a partnership gone south is neither a property of person A or person B. It's a property of
Both.
their
Yeah.
interaction.
Mm.
Or in physics, entanglement is when two particles are interacting and they cannot be separated and act independently. They are dependent on each other for that, whatever that particle produces, light, a waveform, whatever, electricity, whatever it is. And so, we like to think, oh, it's this bug, it's this gene that gives you Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or something. Life is not that simple.
Yeah. If only. Yeah. If
It's
only.
it's
Yeah.
an interactome that hopefully, AI maybe the genetic when the human genome was sequenced, the people that did all the hard work kept saying, "Oh, we're going to cure every disease." I'm like, "No,
Yeah.
you're not." And they haven't.
Yeah.
And same with the microbiome. You're going to like, we can sequence everything and tell you who's going to get an infection post-operatively, but we can't prevent your patient from getting an infection
Yeah.
post.
Yeah. Exactly. So, in the second half or the time remaining, we'll go on to and I know it's unfair, but we'll go into the stuff that matters. Um, so if you were not a surgeon, and I think you kind of probably told us at least a couple of options. If you were not a surgeon, what would you have been? Would have been the music or the diplomat or something else?
Well, here's the thing that is quite interesting as I look back is you kind of at age 20 don't appreciate the talents that you have and that the world will pay you for. Because we all have to eat and we all have to feed our families. No one on this earth gets away with not eating
Yeah,
and hopefully taking care of their family, whether it's their parents or their kids or their spouse or whatever it is. You got to take care of somebody. And and so, you know, I don't know that the person I was at 25, I'm not that same person. So I don't know that it's a fair um, prediction of what I would have done alternatively. Because at age 25, I didn't know how to blow my nose. I was just like every other 25-year-old.
Hmm.
Um, but I would probably say I would have, had I not become a surgeon and not ended up where I ended up and not ended up funded and being able to do the things that I did, I would have done something that allowed me to create an original path for myself. It wouldn't have been like, if somebody said, "Oh, you might have been good in sales,"
Yeah.
and I would have
Yeah.
been selling the same thing, and I would have, maybe made more money than I made and have more money in the bank, and I've been, so what? Doing the same thing over and over again wouldn't have jazzed me up as much. I don't have the talent to be a original composer.
So could you have
I'm
been
not
a, could you have
Herbie
been a,
Hancock. I'm not John Coltrane. All those people I showed you, I'm none of those, and I know it.
could you have
Even
been a
when I play,
politician?
maybe I could have been a successful politician,
Yeah.
but maybe my forte would have been to create um, diplomacy between two people. This is my thing, it's. If you ever read this book by the Harvard negotiation group called Getting to Yes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a book about how you negotiate.
Mm.
It said something to the effect of, it's not his thinking or their thinking that's the problem. It's the very fact that they think that way that is the problem.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
your job I guess, as a diplomat, like maybe you saw happen badly today, I didn't see it, but is to have the equanimity
Yeah.
to be able to get these two bodies to develop some chemistry to solve the problem. That's
It's
why they said getting to yes.
it's
You know,
described in one of the Harvard case studies from the famous episode called A Walk in the Woods, where the Russian and the Americans decided to just walk in the woods at lunchtime and came back realizing that, there's more that they understand about each other than they disagree about each other. Um, so what's your favorite weekend?
well, right now, um, I'm married to the same woman for 42 years. I have two children. My oldest one lives in Lincoln Park in Chicago and has a 7-year-old grandson who I spend a lot of time with. My youngest daughter is a urology resident at Duke University and just had the baby is 11 months old, and we have a place near her so we can go down to Raleigh, Durham. And so I would say um, it's this freedom, and I'm very lucky because I'm at a university. I wrote about this. Somebody, Tim Eberlein, asked me to write about retirement after an article came out about how surgeons should be
Yep.
cognitively tested from the time
Mm.
they're 40 on. And I wrote in there, I said, it's very easy for me to say, oh, this is how you should do it, when I'm lucky that I work alongside a chair and I have tenure and I had a laboratory and I still have a laboratory and NIH funding to continue to work. And I have an administrative hat and I get a salary and I
Yep.
have an office. But I only work 3 days a week. I
Hmm.
go in Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So Monday and Friday, I can go wherever I want. In fact, between you and I, of course, this is going to be, you know, out on in the cyber world.
Well, don't
Uh,
don't overestimate the number of people that will watch it.
yeah, but no, nobody cares. I won't say nobody cares, but I don't have to be there. I'm not accountable to being in the office. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when you say to me, what's your perfect weekend? Well, I sleep in.
Yeah.
I get up at 6 o'clock anyway, but I used to get up at 5:30, but now I can sleep till 6 and sleeping late. and I can tool around on my computer. I can go to Raleigh, Durham and visit my daughter and my granddaughter, so be supportive of them. I can go get on the public transportation and go visit my daughter in Lincoln Park and avoid all the traffic. And I like riding public transportation. And so my favorite weekend is the fact that I've earned the right to do nothing.
To have a 4 day weekend. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, is there a talent that you don't have that you would like to have?
Oh yeah, sure.
What is
So I
it?
play golf. I'd love to be able to be more consistent at golf. I shoot in the low 90s. Once in a while, I'll break 90. And as I mentioned to you when I listen, so when I listen to a brilliant musician playing improvisational music, I mean, I know you know this because you're into it also. The way they improvise and how they do it, it blows my mind. And I have a couple of electric pianos in the basement, and I'll go down there and I'll play, but you just can't bang it out. You just can't be Eric Clapton. You can't be Oscar Peterson. You can't be Herbie Hancock. You want to be, but you just know your limitations. You can't be. Just like you can't hit a drive
Yeah.
I don't like
I've
Striker or
always,
Justin Thomas. You can't do it.
I was always, I think everyone knew that B.B. King could not sing and play the guitar at the same time. Um, and I saw just a tiny clip, which has got to be 40 years old, when somebody just interviewing Eric Clapton said, everybody tells me that you can't play the riff from Layla and sing at the same time. And of course, he sings and plays all the time, and he goes, "Yeah, that's correct." He says, "I can't do that. I've never been able to do it." He says, "I
Or
have to
like,
do da la 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 la," and then I go, "Layla,"
well, how about Keith Richards? He just sits there and it's just like it just comes out of him.
with only 5 strings.
Five strings, yeah. He goes, "What are you cheap?" He goes, "Well, you save money not having." It's like,
Have you
but
ever? Have you
that's
ever
what I'd
asked?
like to do. I'd like to be able to just
Okay,
just sit down and you say, "Okay, let's play in the key of F, and let's just go nuts." And I'd be like,
exactly.
"Just come out of me," and you'd be like, "Amazing," but I can't.
Have you ever asked anyone for an autograph?
No.
Who would
But I
you?
did watch I did watch a 60 Minutes recently after the Bob Dylan movie came out,
Oh, yes, yeah,
where I think was it Maury Safer or no? No, it was one of the 60 Minutes where they were interviewing Dylan, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And they said, "How did you do all this stuff?" And he goes, "I don't know."
yeah.
And they go, "Could you do it now?" He goes, "No way." So what is that?
I think the educationalists would call it unconscious competence. They don't know how they do it. And those people, of course, are usually terrible teachers because they don't know how they how they did it. So well, with that in mind, who in the world, a world-renowned figure, do you admire alive?
Yeah, there's a it's mostly, I would say, brilliant authors like Walter Isaacson, who
Yeah.
writes a lot of the biographies about Einstein
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
Steve Jobs, and I read Da Vinci as you saw in that presentation, and musicians, brilliant authors, and one of my favorites is I don't know if you've read 100 Years of Solitude or Love in the Time of Cholera by Garcia Marquez, who's Colombian.
Right.
They're like,
Yeah.
you know, they're like so over the top. You're like, I could have never come up with this story, but they're just so brilliant. And I've watched interviews, of him, and others, and then musicians.
Oh,
I admire Bob Dylan. I admire Herbie Hancock. I admire songwriters like Ed Sheeran. John Coltrane. Who just the math behind his
yeah.
it's daunting.
And
I think
it's not random, you know.
no, people. I try to say this in the presentation. People listen and they go, "Oh, that's just a lot of noise." I'm like, no, it's not. And the people that analyze it go, it's 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 the purest form of math that you can imagine sound can create.
Yeah, and
Human
if it
sound can,
was random noise, they wouldn't be able to do it again tomorrow, you know, which they can. So,
and when you listen to like Jeff Beck, for example,
oh,
you're like, how?
mm,
How?
mm. Jeff Beck always, God rest his soul, always, every time I watch Jeff Beck playing, it always strikes me that he's looking at the guitar going, what's going on here? You know, he's just interacting with this thing.
Or,
So,
or Jimi Hendrix, they said, he slept with his
yeah,
guitar.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah. No,
he
I heard a
he
guy say, you'd go into the bathroom and he'd be there with the guitar, sitting down with the guitar. It didn't come about by chance. So if you expanded and you had two spare dinner seats on Friday night and you expanded to dead or alive, anyone from history, who would be the two guests that you would invite?
Yeah, that's really good. So that's a good question. So one person that I've read a lot of his books, and is Richard Dawkins. I don't know
Hmm.
if you know who he is. He's a professor. Was it Cambridge or Oxford? I always get those two mixed up.
Uh,
Sorry.
Cambridge, I believe.
I think it was from Cambridge, but
Yeah.
he was an evolutionary biologist and he wrote this book called The Selfish Gene in like 1975, I think. And it was one of these life-altering exposures of how evolution shapes has shaped how we are now and how, it's like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, it's true whether you believe it or not. It's true,
Mm.
like science. And he would be somebody, and I've thought of that question before. I've said,
So
who would I like to just
who
sit
would you
down
sit
and talk
beside
with? And
him?
I'd like to talk to him and say,
Mm.
here's what I've been doing based on your ideas in evolutionary biology with bacteria and surgical disease. In fact, I
That's a
stole,
dangerous thing to say, though, because he might give you a D minus.
he
So
probably would.
who would you sit beside him?
I might sit, the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who I've written a lot, read a lot about, or E.O. Wilson, who I
Yeah,
put in
yeah.
that presentation. E.O. Wilson, another evolutionary biologist. It's just that their thinking is so radical and so profound that it shapes how you think and behave as a human because it's enlightening.
Yes.
And there's few people like that,
I
It's like
once
listening to BB King or Jeff Beck, you're like,
yeah,
ow, you know.
30 years ago or so, I had the opportunity to sit at dinner with the late Sir Richard Doll, who was one of the people, as you know, who described the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer in the 50s. And he was in his 90s at this stage and had been commissioned by the UK government to do some work on the effect of alcohol on health. And I read a little thing in the BJ yesterday about Occam's razor, and I wrote, I'm sitting beside this man, who's contributed in some galactical way, and I'm a young surgeon at that stage, and I said, how's that alcohol thing going? And he said, well, I've already worked out why red wine is healthy. I said, okay, why? And he said, because if you drink too much of it, he says, you have a headache in the morning and you take 2 aspirin. It's the aspirin that does the good. And I thought, Occam's razor. That's why, there was no noise here, etc. So, well, John, we should finish up, and I want to thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to talk to you. I think the world is better for your efforts,
Thank
and
you.
it's been a great pleasure, and I'm really so pleased that you agreed to do it. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you and pleasure knowing you. And look forward to listening to more podcasts from this series, which I think is excellent and just happy to be a part of.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.